the shot went wide. That was the part nobody at Shiloh's Bar and Grill talked about afterward. Not the broken glass, not the blood on the countertop, not even the colonel's face when he finally understood what he'd done. They talked about that first moment, the one where Sergeant First Class Adley Wren set down her beer, looked at the pool table in the corner, and put 4 balls in 4 pockets without once looking at where she was aiming, because she was watching the door. She'd been watching the door since she sat down. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Back to the 45 minutes before everything changed, when Wren was just a woman at a bar nobody thought to look at twice. She'd driven 3 hours from Fort Bragg to get to this particular nowhere. Not because the beer was better, not because she knew anyone. She'd specifically chosen Shiloh's because she didn't. The bar sat at the edge of a small town in rural North Carolina, the kind of place that had a veteran's wall above the jukebox and a Confederate flag in the parking lot that the owner claimed was about heritage, not hate, and everyone had long since decided wasn't worth the argument. Wren had no opinion about the flag. She had opinions about very few things that didn't involve wind speed, elevation, or trigger pull. She was 31 years old, 5'6", 143 pounds, though she'd been measured wrong so many times by people looking at her that she'd stopped correcting them. She had dark circles under her eyes that hadn't gone away since Kandahar. And she wore a gray hoodie 2 sizes, too big over jeans that had a hole at the left knee from a night she didn't talk about. She'd ordered a Bud Light because it was the cheapest thing on the menu, and she wasn't drinking for the taste. She was drinking because she had 4 days of leave and nowhere particular to be, and that particular kind of freedom had always made her more uncomfortable than any mission brief she'd ever sat through. A man at the bar was telling a story about hunting season. Another was explaining, at length, why the Cowboys were going to the Super Bowl this year, despite all available evidence. Wren listened without looking interested. She'd developed that skill a long time ago, absorbing a room without appearing to be part of it. Her first instructor at Sears School had called it situational awareness. Her mother had called it being unfriendly. Both were partially right. There were 3 men at the pool table. She'd cataloged them in the first 30 seconds. 2 in jeans and work boots. 1 in a button-down that was trying too hard for a place like this. The one in the button-down was the problem. She didn't know that yet in any conscious way. She just knew that when a man stands with his feet that wide apart and his voice that loud in a room that small, he's performing something. And performances, in Wren's experience, required an audience, and audiences eventually required participants. She turned back to her beer and decided to be invisible for as long as that was possible. It was possible for about 20 minutes. The woman who came in at 9:15 was named Pascal. Late 20s, red jacket, the kind of smile that assumed everyone in the room was already on her side. She wasn't military. She was a nurse at the county hospital, which Wren would learn later, and she'd come in after a double shift looking for exactly what Wren was looking for. Quiet, cold beer, nobody's business. She made it to the bar stool next to Wren before the man in the button-down said something. Wren didn't catch all of it. She caught enough. Pascal's smile went away. She said something short and direct in response, which was exactly the wrong thing to do because men like the one in the button-down don't make comments like that to get ignored. They make them to establish something. And when a woman responds as if she has standing in the conversation, it reads to them as a challenge. He said it again, louder. Wren picked up her beer. The bartender, older guy, gray ponytail, had probably seen this sequence play out before. Started moving toward the end of the bar, not fast enough. Buttoned down, crossed the room in 4 strides and put his hand on Pascal's arm. She pulled away. He grabbed again. And this time when she pulled, he yanked back, and the crack of it, her shoulder against the bar edge, was loud enough that the hunting story stopped mid-sentence. The room went the particular quiet that rooms go when something shifts from loud to serious. Buttoned down, let go, looked around at everyone looking at him, and then, because he'd miscalculated the situation and needed to recover, he grabbed Pascal's glass off the bar and threw it, not at her, into the general direction of the wall. Dominance display old as the species, the glass shattered. Beer foamed down the painted cinder block next to the veteran's wall, and then Wren stood up. She hadn't planned to. That was the honest version of it, the one she'd give later to the MPs, to the JAG officer, to the colonel's aide who called her 6 days after and spoke very carefully about the situation. She had not planned to get involved. She had 4 days of leave and a strong preference for other people's problems, staying other people's problems. but there was something about the sound of Pascal's shoulder hitting the bar edge. A specific, dense sound. Wren had heard enough of those to know what they meant in terms of force and intent, and what they meant was that Button-Down hadn't miscalculated. He'd made a choice. He'd looked at Pascal and decided she was a thing that could be handled, and handled hard, without consequence. Wren stood up and said very quietly, "That's enough." She said it the way she said most things, without inflection, without volume, without the performance of emotion. It was a statement of fact, not a request, and it landed in the silence like something dropped from a height. Button-Down turned around. He was taller than her by maybe 6 inches, broader by 50 pounds. He had the particular expression of a man who has just been told something he doesn't intend to accept, and he took a long, slow look at her. The gray hoodie, the jeans with the torn knee, the Bud Light she was still holding loosely in her right hand, and he made a decision. "Sit down," he said. "Walk away," Wren said. Someone at the pool table laughed. Not mean, just nervous. The kind of laugh that buys time. Button-Down took a step toward her. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are. My name is Wren," she said. "Now walk away." He didn't walk away. What happened next took about 4 seconds. If you'd blinked at the wrong moment, you would have missed the part that mattered, which was the part where Wren moved first. Not reactively, not defensively, but with the clean preemptive economy of someone who has spent years making the first second count. Button-Down's hand came up. Her left forearm met his wrist. Her right elbow found the pressure point just below his shoulder. His knees buckled. She guided him, and it was a guiding technical and deliberate, down to the floor, where he stayed while she kept one hand on the back of his neck in a grip that communicated, with no ambiguity, that she could change the nature of this interaction significantly if he chose to escalate. He didn't choose to escalate. She held him there for 3 seconds, then released, stepped back, picked up her beer, which she'd set on the bar without spilling a drop before she moved. The room was extremely quiet. "I'd like to pay my tab," Wren said to the bartender. The problem was the silver Charger in the parking lot. She'd noticed it when she arrived. Virginia plates. The kind of parking job that takes up a space and a half. The unconscious arrogance of someone who doesn't expect to be questioned. She hadn't put it together until she walked out and found 3 men leaning against it. Button-Down's friends, who had apparently been outside when things went sideways inside, and who had used the intervening time to have a conversation about what to do about it. The one in the center was not dressed like the others. He was in service uniform, Class A's, which meant he'd come from something formal, a dinner, a ceremony, a base function, and had stopped here afterward, which told Wren something about his judgment even before he opened his mouth. She could read the rank insignia at 40 feet, Colonel. Full bird, Army not her branch. She was Special Forces adjacent, which meant she existed in a separate bureaucratic universe. But she understood what a colonel was, what a colonel carried, what a colonel could do to a sergeant first class who just put one of his people on a barroom floor. He looked at her the way certain officers look at certain enlisted, not as a soldier, not as a human, but as a problem someone else should have solved already. "You want to explain what happened in there?" he said. Wren said, "Your guy grabbed a woman at the bar. I intervened. My guy." He repeated it with the particular tone of someone deciding whether to be amused or offended. "Sergeant Kellum is a decorated combat veteran." "I'm sure he is," Wren said. "You put a decorated combat veteran on the floor of a bar." "I did." The colonel took 3 steps toward her, slow, deliberate, the performance of authority. "What's your name, soldier?" she told him. "Rank, last name, unit," the standard answer. He didn't react to the unit. That was interesting. Most people reacted to the unit. "Sergeant First Class Wren." He said it like he was reading a charge. "Do you understand that I can have your career ended by Monday morning?" Wren said, "I understand that Sergeant Kellum put his hands on a civilian woman inside a public establishment and that I have a bar full of witnesses who saw it. Kellum was provoked." She said no, he continued. "That's not provocation." The colonel's jaw moved. One of the other men shifted his weight. Wren noticed, filed it, stayed still. She had a particular talent for stillness that tended to unsettle people who were used to reading emotion as telegraphed movement because there was nothing to read. Her face didn't change. Her breathing didn't change. She stood exactly the way she always stood, which was with her weight slightly forward, and her hands at her sides, and the absolute patience of someone who has learned to wait in conditions most people couldn't imagine. "I don't know who you think you are," the colonel said, "but I know what you are, and right now, what you are is a sergeant with a very big problem." He reached out. It wasn't a strike, not legally. It was the gesture of a man accustomed to physically punctuating a point, a hand on a shoulder, a finger at a chest, the ownership of space that rank sometimes calculates as its due. But it was fast and it was dismissive, and it landed across the side of her face before she'd finished processing that he'd actually chosen to do it. A slap, open-handed, in a parking lot, in front of 3 witnesses. The shock of it wasn't physical. She'd been hit in ways that made this feel like a weather event. The shock was social. The audacity of it, the bottomless confidence of a man who looked at her and calculated that there was no consequence. She stood there for a moment. The side of her face registered heat. Then she turned and looked at him. And something in her expression, something she hadn't chosen and couldn't have named, made him take one involuntary step back. She didn't hit him back. That was the part that people asked about later. When the story had traveled the way stories travel in military communities, which is fast and inaccurately and all at once. They wanted to know why she hadn't, because she could have. Anyone who'd watched the first 30 seconds of what happened with Kellum knew exactly what she could have done to a man who'd telegraphed his intentions 6 steps before he acted on them. She hadn't because it wasn't the move, not because she was afraid, not because she was restrained by some sense of deference to rank. She had a complicated relationship with deference, always had, but because she understood something about the difference between being right and being effective. And in that parking lot, hitting a colonel in his dress uniform would have collapsed every distinction between her side of the story and his. So she took out her phone. She'd had it on video for the last 2 minutes of the conversation. She'd started recording when he said the word career with that specific inflection because she'd heard that inflection before, and she knew where it led. The recording had his face, his rank insignia, the slap, and his step backward. She said, "Sir, I'd like you to know that this conversation has been recorded." The colonel's face went through several stages very quickly. One of his men said something low and urgent. The colonel said, "You can't use. North Carolina is a one-party consent state," Wren said. "I'm the one party." What came out in the following weeks, in the official investigation that nobody initially wanted to hold, and that eventually couldn't be avoided, was this: Sergeant First Class Adley Wren had, prior to her current assignment, completed 3 deployments to Afghanistan and 1 to Syria. She held a Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest combat decoration in the United States military, awarded for extraordinary heroism under fire. She was, at the time of the incident, attached to a unit whose specific function and mission scope she was prohibited from discussing, which was why she hadn't reacted when the colonel failed to recognize it. She had been, for reasons of operational security, traveling in civilian clothes, and had deliberately not mentioned her service history to anyone at the bar, including the bartender, including Pascal, including button-down Kellum, who turned out to be a desk officer stationed in Fayetteville, whose combat experience was substantially less decorated than the colonel had implied. The investigation into Colonel Dre Sutton, which was not his real name, technically, since this story declines to use real names for reasons you can probably infer, was initiated by the JAG office following receipt of the recording, the bar's security footage, and statements from 11 witnesses, including the gray ponytail bartender, who turned out to have been in the Marines for 8 years and who filed his statement with the kind of organized precision that suggested he'd been waiting for this particular form. Sutton was relieved of his command 6 weeks later. Kellum received a formal reprimand and was required to complete training that he described to his friends as humiliating, which was the point. Wren didn't go back to Shiloh's, not because anything bad had happened there. By her own accounting, the night had gone reasonably well, but because she was constitutionally disinclined to revisit a place once it had become a story. Stories had a way of calcifying locations. She preferred places that were still just places. She did 3 months later receive a letter, handwritten, North Carolina return address, Pascal. She didn't use the word hero in the letter, which Wren appreciated more than she would have appreciated hearing it out loud. She talked about driving home that night and sitting in her car for 15 minutes before she could go inside. She talked about the way Wren had said, "That's enough," how quiet it was, how certain. She said she'd been thinking about it ever since, and had finally decided that a letter was less awkward than a phone call, which she'd tried twice and abandoned. She said, "I want you to know that I understand what it cost. Even when nobody sees what it costs, somebody knows. I know." Wren read the letter twice in her bunk, then folded it and put it in the back of the field journal she'd been carrying since her first deployment. It lived there with a folded photograph and a single rifle cartridge and three other things she didn't talk about. There was a question she got in various forms in the weeks after from the JAG officer, from her CO, from one journalist who'd heard a version of the story and called the base, which got him nowhere. The question was some variation of, she always gave the same answer. She'd told him her name, she'd told him her rank, she'd told him her unit. He had everything he needed to make a different choice, and he'd made this one instead. The question wasn't why she hadn't explained herself. The question, the one nobody thought to ask, was why he'd assumed an explanation was required. There is a thing that happens in the military, as in most hierarchical institutions, where rank becomes a kind of shorthand for worth. Not intentionally, mostly, not maliciously in most cases. But the map gets confused with the territory after long enough, and a man with enough stars on his collar starts to read silence as submission and stillness as weakness, and a woman in a gray hoodie at a bar as something that does not require careful attention. Adley Wren had been not requiring careful attention for 11 years. She'd learned things in that time that couldn't be learned any other way. Not in a classroom, not in a briefing room, not in the carefully controlled environment of a training exercise. She'd learned what her body could do when the margin was zero. She'd learned how fear worked, her own and other people's, and how to be useful in the exact moment when most people became useless. She'd learned that the things worth protecting rarely look like what you expect them to look like, and that the people most dangerous to cross are often the ones who appear to have nothing to prove. The colonel had looked at her and seen nothing to worry about. He'd been wrong in a way that ended his career. She didn't consider this a victory, exactly. She didn't consider it much at all. There was another mission brief coming, another week of terrain and variables and problems to solve, and she'd learned a long time ago that spending energy on the past was a tax on the future, and she had very particular plans for her future. She got in her truck. She drove back to Bragg. She had 9 hours before she had to be back in uniform. She used 6 of them to sleep, 2 to run 12 miles in the dark, along a route she'd mapped 3 years ago, and kept as her own, and 1 to sit on the tailgate of her truck in the parking lot of a gas station outside of Rayford and drink a cup of coffee that was bad in every measurable way and exactly what she needed. She thought about Pascal's letter, about the word costs, about the way it had been used without performance, without pity, without the slightly exhausting implication that she should feel some particular way about what she'd done. Somebody knows. She folded the thought away, not because it didn't matter, because it mattered precisely enough that she wanted to keep it somewhere. It wouldn't get worn down by being examined too often. She finished the coffee, threw the cup in the trash, pulled back onto the highway. The road was empty at that hour, which was how she preferred it. 1 lane, 1 direction, no ambiguity about where she was going or why. Dawn was still 2 hours out. The pine trees on either side of the highway were black shapes against a slightly less black sky, and somewhere, up ahead, the base was already running its first PT formation, the kind that happened before the rest of the world had decided to be awake. She'd be there for it. She was always there for it. That was the only fact about Adley Wren that people who actually knew her would have said without hesitation. Before the story, before the parking lot, before the recording that traveled through 3 states' worth of military gossip and ended a man's career on a Tuesday morning in November. Not what she'd done, not what she was capable of, just that she showed up every time for the thing that needed doing. No announcement, no explanation required. She drove toward the lights.